this is Paul Gale from paulgalenetwork.com, and thank you for joining me today for this unboxing video of the Nintendo 64 and Sega Genesis controllers designed for the Nintendo Switch to work with the Nintendo Switch Online expansion pack service. Here I have the box, and I'm about to open it, but first I thought I would give you a little look at the NES controller and the Super NES controller released by Nintendo for the Nintendo Switch Online service. These I've had for a while, and these were fantastic. They work really well with the intended games. NES, you slide on like this, and this is how it charges. The control is perfect. There are no shoulder buttons, except for L and R, but that's to navigate within the menu to go back to pause and rewind and stuff like that. You've got your start and select. They feel really good. Super Nintendo one, of course. Charges by USB-C, which is included in the box. Here you have the start, select, all of the buttons. Perfectly fits and feels in my hands just like my old school SNES controller. I love it. In addition to the L and R, which is a part of the normal controller, you have ZL and ZR, and that's to access the menus and rewinding and such. Now, before I open up the box, I do have my original old school Nintendo 64 controller. What's going to be different on this one is this part's going to be filled with plastic, so you cannot put a rumble pack or a memory card or a data transfer pack for, Pokemon Stadium or Hey You Pikachu, nothing like that. But this is my controller. Still works just fine. Analog stick. I love this thing. I'm going to open it up, put a direct side-by-side comparison to this and the Nintendo 64 one, and also see what the Sega Genesis controller looks like. I am stoked. I have been having fun with the expansion pack games so far, enjoying much of the Nintendo 64 library and the Sega Genesis library. You can't remap the controls on the Pro Controller. So in some games cases, on Nintendo 64 side in particular, you kind of have a little bit of a weird setup. You could just use the right analog stick to replicate the 4C buttons, but it is different touching a button as it was designed than flicking to the left, the right, the up, or the down position. Here are the two boxes, by the way. I'm assuming this is the Nintendo 64 one since it is a bigger controller. I'm going to open up the N64 one first. We'll save the Sega Genesis one for the end, I guess. But yeah, the whole situation with not being able to remap does leave you with a little bit of a weird position. But it's like, well, what could Nintendo do? There aren't enough buttons on the face of a Pro Controller or the Joy-Con to exactly replicate the N64 controller. Would it have been nice to be able to remap in-game? Yes. Maybe that will be an option that they add, but I don't know. You can, however, go into the Nintendo Switch system settings and remap there. I think some people forgot about that necessarily and are kind of making it a bigger deal, like it's impossible to remap where you want the buttons to be. But you can. However, that would also be kind of on a game-by-game basis because there may be some titles that you, those all look nice. There may be some titles that you don't want it to be exactly, this is left C, this is up C, this is right C, this is down C, and just replicate that on Y, X, A, B. Maybe you want to change it up, and, just having that option in the Nintendo Switch game menu would be easier instead of going to systems and having all of these different setups, per N64 title. But you may be able to get a general gist of it and make every game have this as this button and this as this button. But like I said, it's a game-by-game scenario because different titles functioned differently. For instance, in Ocarina of Time, the C buttons did not control the camera. So you may want a different setup for Mario 64 than Ocarina of Time on your Pro Controller. But that being said, that's another story. That's another topic. That's nothing really new. This is what's new. People have shown this off online, so I'm not the first, but these are my own impressions for the first time. And I am stoked. Don't want to damage the box. I like to keep the boxes. I've got a lot of them. Oh, that looks awesome. It's the same setup in this case as the SNES one. A little bit of a plastic. Oh, this is so exciting. This is cool. I love this controller. All right, the box still has some weight to it because behind is the USB Type-C cord. I'll tuck that in there. Might not necessarily use it, as I do have quite a few USB Type-C cords at this point in time. But here we go. Oh gosh, that is so cool. That feels so good. This is a piece of art for me. I'm going to have this on my entertainment stand in front of the TV. I have my PlayStation 5 controller, and next to it is my NES Classic Edition. Then is my Nintendo Switch Pro controller, Super Nintendo Classic Edition, and then my Xbox Series X controller. And on the bottom shelf is the PlayStation 5 console itself, the Nintendo Switch, an Amazon Fire TV Cube behind that, and then the Xbox Series X next to it. And on the bottom shelf are like family photos, and I've got a little King Kong and a Godzilla figure and different things like that. But I'm going to do some slight rearranging, and I'm going to have the Nintendo 64 wireless controller and the Sega Genesis controller joining what I'm going to, like I said, reconfigure some things, have the SNES constantly out there, the wireless one, and the NES one constantly out there, its wireless one. I do have, of course, the corded SNES and NES controllers for their respective classic consoles, but more often than not, they're kind of used for, like I said, visual art than playing them, because if I'm going to play, I'm playing usually wirelessly, and I'm playing on the Nintendo Switch Online service. But I still love having those physical, smaller systems. Let's look at this controller, though. That is beautiful. This is still one of my favorite controllers of all time ever released. I don't get why there's kind of a dislike in some people's minds to this controller. Like, does anybody think that it was supposed to be played like this back in the day? Yeah. Does anybody new nowadays hop onto it and be like, how do I do that? How do I do this? Yeah, I guess, I mean, that exists. But for me, the marketing campaign hit perfectly well. I played like this, and this was the vast majority of the games, and this felt wonderful. You had Z trigger right here. You just run and go, yeah, woohoo! Do the long jump for Mario. Just felt so natural. Of course, the trigger going left for a barrel roll to the left in Star Fox 64, or a beautiful trigger for shooting games like GoldenEye 007 and Perfect Dark, aiming. I wish that, and I said this in previous videos of mine, I wish that the Nintendo 64 had Street Fighter games. Capcom didn't really support N64 all that well. Yeah, they did a Mega Man Legends 64 and a Resident Evil 2 port, but it wasn't really until Nintendo GameCube where Capcom came back in full force. NES, SNES, a lot of support. N64, they missed the boat, because this right here, this 6-button face layout with 2 shoulder buttons, that would have been perfect for Street Fighter Alpha 3, Street Fighter 3. And for that matter, I also mentioned this before, but Street Fighter 3 was in development at some time, at some little point in stage in around 1997, and N64 build of it. I would love to see a sneak peek behind the scenes of what that game ever shaped up to being, you know? I'd be very intrigued. 360 pile drivers like this, Hadokens like that, that'd be perfect. Here are the two side by side, virtually identical. I say virtually identical because when you look at the top, that's where the differences begin. On this one, of course, you have 4 lights that light up, telling you what player are you, 1, 2, 3, or 4. You have that little sync button right there. Here you have that screenshot capture button, and then you've got the home button and a ZR button. So with the ZR button, you could navigate the menu and go back into, reset the game on Nintendo Switch Online service, etc. Otherwise, this is going to be the preferred way to play N64 games on the Nintendo Switch Online service. Like I said, the back is hollowed out. It has the same amount of screws. One thing that I will note that's different, the classic controller, as insignificant as it may be, is that there are 2 little gray squares above the Z button and a little circle indent right there. Neither of those are present here. And also, on the front of the controller, this has a little hole in the middle of the analog stick, and this new one does not. It's been hollowed out, just plastic. But otherwise, yeah, you're looking at two virtually identical controllers that will feel the same and give you that feeling of, well, in my case, being a kid again, being a teenager again, having a Nintendo 64 in my hands. I still have my original consoles hooked up. In fact, today, on this date of October 28th, 2021, I played some NES at my parents' house, original Super Mario Brothers, original Duck Hunt, had my daughter and I enjoy it together. My son and I oftentimes play together too on these classic systems at my parents' house. Old systems are the best. They're really cool to play them on the intended format on the old school TV boob tube setup. But of course, many of the titles are available now on either Virtual Console or other platforms such as Wii U that had a pretty good backwards compatible scene and, you know, a nice eShop and whatnot. But yeah, playing the consoles the way they're intended on the classic platforms is just a really fun experience. But definitely having that ease of access to a lot of these games and more coming along the way in the Nintendo Switch Online service on the Nintendo Switch on your big TV at home without cables and all that stuff, it's going to be pretty nice and pretty convenient. So I'm a fan of the past, but I'm also a fan of new. And when you have a way to bridge the gap, that's pretty sweet. All right, let's open up the Sega Genesis controller. And then I really want to have a nice side-by-side shot of the Genesis controller and the Super Nintendo one, because if you were a kid in the early 90s, that was the battle on the playground. That was like almost peak console wars. I don't know, looking back, what was more powerful of a competition in terms of word of mouth and popularity, and who would you side with? The Super Nintendo versus Sega Genesis 16-bit war, or Nintendo 64 versus Sony PlayStation 32-bit / 64-bit war. But either one of those, you know, probably takes the top billing, and both generations went down in history as, you know, the stuff of legend. But this right here, this is quite a unique piece. This is a Sega Genesis controller made by Nintendo for a Nintendo platform. Just think about that. If you're young, and I should say, that looks so cool. If you're young enough that you were not a part of this generation, Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, when it was going down, maybe you don't quite grasp what this is like for somebody that's 38 to open it up, that, you know, lived the battle, that, you know, had access to different games on different platforms. And then nowadays, you know, Sega as a third party, all that stuff is ancient history. But this is a big deal. And if you are, you know, still young in your 30s or 40s or late 20s, and you did experience this, you know what it's like. When you open your own, you'll feel it too. USB Type-C right there, included with the Sega Genesis. And here we go. Let's see what this is like. Oh man, that's wild, dude. You have the mode button on top to switch ABC, XYZ. This is the choice that Nintendo went with for the North American audience. I know a lot of people thought it was surprising, especially since the Japanese Nintendo Switch Online Sega Genesis controller, which is the Sega Mega Drive outside of the US, including Europe, has the 6-button layout controller that was released kind of alongside Street Fighter II Championship Edition, because that was Sega's first big third-party game and their first Street Fighter game, for that matter, that definitely benefited from 6 buttons instead of, you know, doing A and B at the same time, or B and C, or A and C, or using a mode. This has a start, home right here, and a capture button right there. And this is cool. This feels just like an old school controller. Comparable weight, I would say, if I could remember back. I don't have a corded version. This is chargeable by cord, but you know, I don't have the corded original Sega Genesis controller on hand to show a direct side-by-side comparison like I did with the Nintendo 64 one. But yeah, this is going to be a lot of fun too. This was a comfortable controller back in the day. My preference though, Super NES as a controller, by default, from the start, this evolution was greater realized, I think. Went from 2 buttons to curved appeal with 4 buttons that have stood the test of time, and a 2 shoulder, very natural. As opposed to this, you know, this also came out in between NES and Super NES, so, you know, they went with a pretty nice D-pad and 3 buttons instead of 2, and just a start button, but it did have a mode. But this was farther along than this. When this ended up having its 6-button layout, that became very nice for fighting games, whether you were playing Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter on the Sega Genesis controller. But there you have the 16-bit wars right there. Sega Genesis controller was a fair amount bigger, wasn't it? Yeah. But they both felt pretty good in your hands. We could probably hide the Super NES controller completely. Yeah. Would it have been nice? Probably. Made more sense, I think. Yeah. If Nintendo made the Sega Genesis controller for the North American Nintendo Switch Online service be the 6-button one, yeah, because that's more future-proof right there. Like, what if Nintendo does bring Street Fighter II Championship Edition to the Nintendo Switch Online Sega Genesis portion, and if you're in the North American market, this is what you bought on the Nintendo Switch Online, you know, eShop. Well, not eShop necessarily, but the Nintendo Online store. You would have wanted the 6-controller one, right? 6-button controller one. I guess you could play with your N64 controller. That'd be pretty cool. Of course, you have your default Joy-Con. You have your Pro controller that many people have. Japan got it. Nintendo's reasoning, North American audiences relate this more to their Sega Genesis memories, their experiences, whereas Japan related more to the 6-button layout. I could see that. And yeah, I understand why. Maybe even they will release later on the 6-button one. If they do, I'll probably buy that too. The 6-button layout was kind of a smaller design controller, more akin to the eventual Sega Saturn controller, which was kind of like this, a little bit smaller, 6-button layout. So yeah, Sega Saturn. Well, but also they had a different curvature to it. Yeah, significantly different in terms of curvature, but Sega Saturn 6-button layout, which was its default, and the Model 2 of this controller were definitely more comparable than this one and Sega Saturn. And then Sega Dreamcast really changed it up. And I kind of want to end on that note, maybe. Coming up next, I think we're going to get like a Game Boy Color, maybe even a Game Boy Advance as part of the expansion pack. We've seen some files come out, and it looks like there is one more console that's at least shoved kind of in there. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's along the way. But what if to follow would be Sega Dreamcast and Nintendo GameCube? That would be huge. That would be a massive win, because Sega Dreamcast was a great system that came out back in 1999 that did not sell well, but it's more thought of now highly in people's minds than it was kind of at the time. Not to say that people at the time didn't appreciate it, but definitely it was underappreciated by the majority of the population. Looking back, people are like, wow, that was a cool system, but it just got destroyed by early PlayStation 2 hype, and then Nintendo GameCube and Xbox came out, and Dreamcast didn't stand a chance anymore. But if Sega Dreamcast could live again on Nintendo Switch Online, and once again have a Sega Dreamcast controller made in 2022 or 2023 by Nintendo for a Nintendo console, that'd be crazy. And Nintendo make a Wavebird, which I love. And I'm one of the first people in the world to own a Wavebird. I won a Wavebird from Nintendo at E3 back in May of 2002. So I got it before it was available to the rest of the world in June the following month. So I love the Wavebird system. And it'd be interesting to see if they would do something else with the Wavebird, like, you know, this is hollowed out on here, would the opposite be true on the Wavebird? Because the Wavebird had a section below it in between the left and the right, you know, yellow C-stick on the right, deep head on the left. Instead of it being hollowed out like a normal GameCube controller, it was filled in because that's where you had the extra battery compartment for the 2 AA's and the wireless transmitter to connect to the connector on the Nintendo GameCube that was plugged into a controller port. So would they just kind of basically create a Nintendo GameCube controller but call it a Wavebird and make it wireless? I don't know. I would buy it. I'd buy all of them. That's going to do it though today. We've got the Nintendo 64. We've got the Sega Genesis. Let's get the family here. Let's get everybody in this shot. Bam. That's not really a great looking shot, but it's kind of awkward to hold these 4 controllers at once. So there you go. We've got everybody here in this weird shot. Maybe this will end up being the screenshot of the video. All right. This is Paul Gale from PaulGaleNetwork.com signing out. Hope you all have a good one. Thanks for watching with me. Let me know what you thought, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.